Good afternoon and welcome to GLFx Cape Town. This event is entitled Fostering Collaboration for Restoration in the Global South and is intended to launch the Cape Town chapter of GLFx and introduce you to our work and aims. Some housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, but none of your faces or identities will feature in the recording. It'll just be what you see on your screen. We'll also be posting links in the chat box throughout the webinar of ways to get involved and for you to follow up. And please do go ahead and post some questions through the Q&A function. We'll address these as we go or pose them to our speakers at the end. To give you a bit of a background, GLFx Cape Town is part of the GLFx Community. The GLFx Community is an initiative of the Global Landscapes Forum, which is intended to create a community-centered, decentralized movement for landscape level change. The Global Landscapes Forum itself is the world's largest knowledge-led platform on sustainable land use dedicated to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. GLFx Cape Town is comprised of a consortium of local organizations working across diverse landscapes, multiple communities, and a range of specializations and disciplines. This includes representatives from academia, NGOs, civil society, and grassroots organizations. The chapter intends to offer a holistic and well-coordinated program of events and project activities whilst promoting collaboration in the sector locally, amplifying the work of existing organizations, and leveraging established audiences and networks. Founding members of the chapter include Greenpop Foundation, the African Climate and Development Initiative, Conservation South Africa, Living Lands, Rewild Africa, and the Collective Movement. Our mission is to accelerate action in South Africa by enabling individuals and groups with the necessary knowledge, technology, and networks to connect, share, learn, and most importantly, act through a holistic approach in their local landscapes. Last week, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration was launched, setting off a 10-year-long campaign for protecting, restoring, and conserving our global natural resources. This campaign is well placed as we enter the final stretch to achieving the SDGs by 2030 and the deadline for averting irreversible climate damage. GLFx and GLFx Cape Town are just some actors in a network of global stakeholders mobilizing local communities to achieve the necessary restoration goals. We as a chapter, aim to address some of the more subtle themes related to restoration to really put including COVID-19 and social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. In South Africa, and the structural racist legacies of apartheid. By framing restoration as accessible and inclusive to all and providing the tools and platforms to this end, we hope to encourage broader participation in these processes. Today's event will be the first in a series of activities from the chapter to encourage and mobilize restoration efforts locally and to grow GLFx Cape Town network and produce a toolkit of resources to enable successful restoration and to empower local activists. To kick us off, I'd like to hand over to one of Greenpop's founders and directors, Misha Teasdale. Greenpop is one of the founding members of the GLFx Cape Town chapter, and Misha is going to be telling us a bit more about Greenpop and introducing the first clip.
Hi, everyone. So lovely to be here finally. It's been a long time coming. My name is Misha. I'm one of the founders of the Greenpop Foundation. We're an award-winning non-profit and we're based in Cape Town. We do work all over sub-Saharan Africa. And we work to restore ecosystems and empower environmental stewards through forest restoration, urban greening, food gardens, environmental awareness. We began a decade ago, which is pretty amazing considering how much has happened in the last decade. And in that time, we've managed to plant over 150,000 trees and inspired somewhere in the region of 135,000 active citizens across South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania. Today, I'm really proud to introduce an initial clip that we're going to be sharing with you. It was filmed by two friends of mine, Sam Chevalier from Rewild and Cape Town-based filmmaker Skull Khanoko. And one of our partners, Open Forests, who've got a phenomenal restoration app or a mapping app. A chap called Gil Ribeiro supported us with doing some editing work. So yeah, if you'd like to start the video, this is the first time we're actually screening it. Thank you.
When I started this journey, I'd never planted a tree before. Here we are 10 years later and we've planted 140,000 trees. Every single time one of those trees is planted, it's another legacy, it's another intention of reconnecting with nature.
I've been coming year after year, and every year is a different experience and gives me different things to think about and take home with me.
I think it's easy to be forgotten how prevalent nature is around us, especially people that live in cities. It's like you see trees every now and then, but being in a space that's mostly trees or even planting it yourself, it's like this is a world that exists more than just my breath.
I think that tree planting is important because it really puts you in a space to get intimate with nature.
So I think when we connect with nature, we can't help but connect with our true selves.
The way that we've been engaging with the planets, with ourselves, with our landscapes, it's really destructive. And it doesn't have to be.
It's incredibly pertinent to so many of our ills, whether they be ecological or social. The reforestation program supports a lot of jobs. It's become an industry of its own. And it's something that has given my life the most incredible meaning.
There's just this massive knock-on effect that can happen by actively engaging with financing restoration with a very open mind. We believe that there's just a whole spectrum of value that's going to come out of this. What we need to do is get more people into the landscape. So hosting an event like this, where you can get 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people together to actively start participating in the process, I believe is a really powerful way to start shifting that mindset. So I'm excited about this next decade, and I feel like there's this critical role that we all have in making this a reality. Saying, like, how am I going to jump in? What's my role? How am I going to make this happen? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Greenpop, for sharing that with us and for introducing that measure. To move swiftly along, not to reduce anything said previously, I'd like to introduce us to our panel member for today, Nicole Rodel. Nicole is the junior manager at the African Climate Reality Project, which is the African branch of the Climate Reality Project founded by US Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore. Nicole joined ACRP in 2018 as communications officer and is specialized in environmental and advocacy journalism. She worked on Action 24, Active Citizens and Responsive Legislatures, the project aimed at fostering more effective and meaningful public participation in environmental governance in South Africa since its inception. And it was through this project that the climate justice docuseries, Not on Our Soil, A Climate Justice Reality, was produced together with Rewild Africa. Welcome, Nicole. Really
Hi, Emma, and thanks everyone for having me here today.
Cool. To kick us off, could you tell us more about the process of making the film and your objectives and aims?
Sure. So the docuseries, which you've already mentioned, was produced under the project Action 24, Active Citizens for Responsive Legislatures, and that was aimed at fostering meaningful public participation in environmental governance in South Africa. All of the characters featured in the docuseries are connected to the project, and we really wanted to use the power of storytelling to highlight the issues that affect them and their communities, and through the characters' actions in their communities, inspire others to realize their rights as citizens by actively participating in the decisions that affect the future of our country and its people. Key to this message was that climate change is not an environmental issue, but a human rights issue that is intersectional with and cuts across gender, class, race, and the many socioeconomic challenges that South Africans are faced with. We also had the pleasure to work with the incredible team at Rewild Africa to bring these stories to life. And I asked them to share some of their behind the scenes insights so that I could pass it on to everyone that's here today. So each of the 4 provinces that they traveled through are environmentally unique, housing up to 9 different biomes. But the cultural diversity is the country's most glorious asset, and the subjects' portraits in the docuseries are proof of that richness. The inequalities experienced are both visible and striking, and the team's travels led them to encounter the change makers that are taking action on the ground to bring awareness to the most urgent social and environmental issues. Their production mission was to highlight and spread awareness on how environmental damage goes hand in hand with social issues, with an aim to reconnect the two and empower the citizen to understand cause and effects and take part in the journey towards justice. And that was a golden thread of the project, that there is no environmental justice without social justice. And now our aim with the series is to inspire more citizens to become active in our democracy by understanding our rights and engaging elected representatives through public participation to facilitate and create meaningful policy change to advance the just transition to a sustainable and equitable development pathway that leaves no one behind.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. I've seen the clips before, but for those in our audience that haven't seen them before, you're definitely in for a treat. They're beautifully emotive storytellings, and it's really lovely to connect with those characters. Nicole has selected a couple of episodes for us to screen today, the first being the community episode, which will start now.
If and when climate change impact progresses, the marginalized communities, as we know, they're at the forefront of feeling the results of the changing climate. If our systems and a governance level don't change, if the priorities of our governments stay the same, then the vulnerabilities will just exacerbate. The system is reproducing an unjust setting in society where some groups are going round in circles rather than being given opportunities to further their lives and have a better living. Water highlighted a lot of inequalities or injustices in the city of Cape Town. If water is available, it's dirty, it's a burst sewage that is flowing on the streets and kids are playing with dirty water. If it's clean, it's not available or it's very little. But in comparison with other areas in the same landscape, same city, water is swimmable, it's clean, people can afford to pay the bill. Water becomes a political tool to control. It becomes a very dangerous topic. Our work is to go into communities to try and distract power by creating a space where communities can question in understanding the politics around water. How do they hold themselves responsible for what they can control, but also when it comes to being serviced, what is the government supposed to do? How much resources does government put into making sure that the river is taken care of throughout until it enters the ocean? Environmental Monitoring Group tries to not talk on behalf of communities. What we try to do is to empower people so they can talk. When a community is aware, but also have given the tools, and then the agency is facilitated or given space, then a lot can happen. They can resist things that undermine their humanity. They can challenge things that deprive them of pride. They can negotiate. They become very, very political in a way that empowers them, but also really give meaning of the word freedom. There's a change in perspective and a relationship with water, but also there's a sense of agency, sense of ownership, sense of respect. There's so many needs that are met when you engage with communities in a holistic manner, and also take time. Relationships are important. Listen, they have a voice. Just maybe previously that group of people wouldn't have been given a voice or a space to voice out their opinions. The inability to describe or even relate to the literature of climate change and environmental literacy in townships, it's a huge block. We talk about it at a very high level that alienates someone who doesn't resonate with that word, but at the same time they suffer the consequences every day. There's another way of really contextualizing climate change by putting it into lived experiences. Our approach is to facilitate community-led alternatives because that's where the shift is. A vegetable garden can tell you an entire story of climate change. Then at that moment, but you're addressing what is important in a priority list of someone who's poor, food. There's food on the table, and then let's talk about climate change. Because again, you can't come and talk about climate change while people don't have enough food on the table or they're looking for jobs. The psychology, the well-being of a person is important. Community-led alternatives need sustainable change that can be there, where there is sustained independence, sustained pride, and continuing change that dignifies how people live. Realizing yourself beyond you. Being edified by a sense of being around a group of people, and you see just another dimension of you. So it's that expansion of your realization. Communities are not projects. Communities are systems. They are fascinating, they are complex, and they change. When you have someone or another group making a decision on behalf of another, that is unjust and unsustainable because that decision might be rejected. But if they were part of a decision, if they are, there would be a lot of care, a lot of creativity and ownership. It's really about the humanity of these particular individuals. They could be living in one street or sharing the same idea of change, but there is a thing that connects them, that makes them a community. If those who have are able to take and take and take, and those who don't have are just at the receiving end, there is something wrong with that picture. But also those at the receiving end have a responsibility to take care of the little that gets to them. But who are to judge? Because the priorities are not the same. The priorities are survival, food on the table. Our work is to always try and change the relationship we have with the environment. If it's a toxic relationship, we try and make it healthy. If it's a greedy relationship, we try and make people see that it's enough to share for everyone. My work, interacting with different communities, brings a lot of emotions. To tell you the truth, it's exhausting, but it's kind of anger exhaustion. It's not sad. It's just a place where you know that it won't change today. But again, if you don't do anything about it, it may not change ever. Realizing that we're moving small pieces of the puzzle and having hope that someday things will shift fundamentally. My name is Mieza. I believe that there is no environmental justice without social justice.
Thank you for that. I've just got a couple of questions just to start conversation around that. A recurring theme in that episode and in climate justice discussions generally is how vulnerable communities, and by extension, less developed countries, bear the brunt of governance decisions that often don't include them. And they bear the brunt that the more affluent sectors of society, whether that is the global north or more westernized industrialized nations, or if it's just within a society, the more affluent suburbs and societal members, it bearing the brunt of their unsustainable consumption. And these impacts ultimately reproduce systems of injustice and inequality that in South Africa are already so entrenched and in the global south are replicated. As a kind of question to start the discussion, what do you regard as the priorities to disrupting this vicious cycle and to promoting more empowering and inclusive social and climate justice?
Thanks. So I think really fighting the climate crisis needs systemic change from our society. And to do that, we have to put the knowledge and experience of the people that are most affected at the forefront of decision-making processes. It's not just about educating ourselves about climate change, but listening to and learning from the most affected people at the front lines of climate change causes and impacts. And I think that's also really at the heart of the just transition or the just recovery, which is very much a priority in the work that we do and why we emphasize that there is no climate justice without social justice. The climate crisis really is embedded within the context of growing inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And so we need to fight for equity, for a world where we all breathe clean air and drink safe water, for a future where marginalized and vulnerable communities aren't suffering the worst of climate change impacts, to fight for good jobs and real opportunities for all. And really, as I said earlier, leave no one behind.
And I guess the high level institutions like the Congress of the Parties, COP, and the Paris Agreement, they dominate the airspace. That's where a lot of the conversation and the attention of the climate discussions is happening. But Sia of MNG, he spoke about how environmental literacy is a barrier, particularly in how the literature about climate change can alienate those communities and those community members that are already bearing the brunt of the climate change. And that there's that disconnect and that alienation that is created from these high-level discussions that need to take place in order to prompt countries and companies to react. But at the same time, we need to do it in a way that is also bringing those communities along as active stakeholders and as empowered members of those communities. What can we, as the audience here today, what role can we play in helping to advocate for better environmental education in schools, communities, public awareness campaigns to help bridge that gap so that climate change discussions are not just happening in ivory towers, remote from the realities on the ground?
Sure. So I think first off, while the language of those high-level institutions when it comes to climate change dialogues, so also including, for instance, the South African government, it may create a barrier for inclusive participation and engagement, but we can still see that vulnerable communities who may not have that scientific language to explain why the climate is changing are still very much aware of the changes taking place. And that comes in with traditional and indigenous knowledge as well. So I think it also goes back to what Sia was saying, how when you're having these conversations, you need to relate it to your audience and communicate and engage on these issues in a way that is relevant to them and their priorities, and then start having conversations about what we as citizens can do. So in terms of what the audience here today can do, we can engage our elected representatives, particularly to advocate for formalizing climate and environmental education as part of school curricula. There are various formal processes for engaging our legislatures and parliament that I would encourage everyone to get familiar with. not just for advocating for this particular point, but for learning how to actively participate in the decision-making and policy processes that affect us as citizens. There's also so many civil society and community-based organizations working in this space in our country, and there's real power for meaningful change in collaboration and supporting each other and sharing our knowledge and resources to reach new audiences and communities within our networks, and at the same time, supporting more South Africans in becoming active citizens advocating for environmental and social justice.
Awesome. And that links so closely to the objectives of GLFx Cape Town in terms of being able to leverage the networks that we have as a consortium of organizations, and to use that to amplify messages and to introduce audiences to organizations that they might not be familiar with or processes that they're uncertain of. And at the same time, to empower those audiences with tools like email templates and even just contact details of ways that they can get involved and activate to practice democracy and to practice that global activism that is so necessary for us to move forward and to progress. Yeah, wonderful. The next film that you selected for us today is the gender episode, which is a theme particularly close to my heart, and I think close to the heart of a lot of us here in the audience today. Yeah, so we'll kick off with that.
Great. Just give me 1 second to share my screen.
The erosion of the soil is the erosion of the soul. I must have been aware of how land changed, but the time I saw how that changed the people, to see that people were crying for what is gone, soil that cannot give anymore. If you want to defend life, the gender-based violence, for an example, bring people back to what they know better and bring back people to what they are. As a girl and as a woman, the main struggle has been always around water. On your way to fetch water, anything could happen. Harassment, rape, the force into relationships, they are rooted in that a girl cannot decide. When you are abducted for a marriage, you get taken to the house of the man and you get raped. If you are a fighting woman, the others hold you. If your virginity is taken, then your pride goes. My grandmother, when that happened to me, she had a final saying, I'm a Christian, we don't allow these kind of things. And it worked. I didn't get to be raped because she came just the following day. She broke all the rules, kicked the door, it flew open, and then she got into the house and then say, you're going out. I will be always grateful for that. I left and went to stay in Cape Town and hide there for some time. My grandmother, she wrote me such a beautiful letter while I was running away. And she said to me, I do not understand, but I fully support you. If this is going to make you to get education, then go for it. I said, Sbongile, now you have got yourself to being a leader. You're leading other girls. I needed to break the boundaries of my tradition. I chose to be a young woman of the community who can create her own identity. And I was scared and I knew it was not right, but I had to do it because I think something bigger now in me lived. I believe that people, once they are conscientized, people can make choices. It is at the level of awareness that makes me to take action, and not just an easy action, but even the very, very difficult ones, and own that as my identity. Women's Leadership and Training Program does that with girls, create that for others. What I would really like for the girls is to understand that when they're protecting the environment, it's not about something that is abstract and out there. It's about protecting themselves and their identity and who they are. They must understand the climate science, and then of course the traditional things are important as well, so marry those kinds of knowledge. We've seen a lot of changing in the weather behaviors, but for us, how we read it is the time to plant, the availability of water. It tells us that things are not the same and are not going according to what we know. The calling of birds. There's a cuckoo that calls us to plant. And now this cuckoo, it comes in October. And that's not usual for us. This area has been taken over by timber, and we begin to wonder what would have life been if communities had all the grazing land. In the agroecology, farming, the homestead can have life that promotes diversity. What we can do is to bring all the things that we need into our lives closer to home. The reason we created these gardens that have fruit trees and everything is not for us only, is to attract the biodiversity, the bees, the birds. When it comes to climate change, trees are carbon sinks. The girl cannot just plant because that says so much about ownership, but we've negotiated and navigate around those power issues. Working with girls for me is to build constituency of a younger voice that is different from mine. When I think of the future of the earth, it needs citizens like that. Citizens that are going to embrace life as a whole, as a gift to protect, to co-create something better. Although we are the group of women, I've seen some men coming and say, can we join the group? Now all the men are working in the field, not gender-based violence. No, I wouldn't say that. But when young men are conscientized, when you bring them into one space of working into a garden or testing the water, something changes in them in terms of relationship. For policies to be really meaningful, they must be solving what is a problem for a specific group or groups. For the girls here, they've never seen anyone testing water. Now they begin to say, but we are the ones who are affected. So it is very important for girls and women to be empowered to be able to do that. Participation of girls and women is about telling your story, the way you experience it, not the way it's written. My name is Bongile Mdungwa. My hope is on equity. I hope for justice. I hope for a better environment and indigenous knowledge to live, and spirituality is what runs in me.
Beautiful again. My first question is something that I see a couple of people in the chat have also flagged, is that quote, the erosion of the soil is erosion of the soul. And Ngile makes an important recommendation with that in including indigenous and traditional knowledge, as well as spirituality, as a complement to these like new scientific knowledge systems. Like women generally, these knowledge systems have historically not been included in climate discussions. They've, if anything, been actively marginalized in certain spaces, or that information has been captured by mainstream science without a cognizance or recognition of where that knowledge comes from and the origins of those practices that have been practiced for thousands of years. And increasingly that is shifting. As far as I can see, that is changing. Indigenous people, women, traditional knowledge is getting more recognition in these spaces. But how can we continue to promote and amplify this expertise, disrupting the kind of privileging of certain bodies of knowledge, and also building better accessibility in the knowledge production and sharing space generally, kind of linking to the point before about literacy and how do we bridge the gap between the legalese of COP and the Paris Agreement with the realities on the ground.
Sure. So Indigenous and traditional knowledge certainly is key to helping the world adapt to and mitigate climate change. And it's crucial, as Sibongile said, that we marry that knowledge with scientific data and recommendations by grounding our innovation in nature. I think this can also come back to decision-making processes and policy development. For example, when there's a proposed legislation or draft amendments to a bill, that will be open for public submissions. So, for example, last year there was opportunity to comment on draft amendments to the National Environmental Management Act. And then we have the opportunity as citizens to analyze those policies and evaluate if it is representative of both traditional and scientific knowledge, and inclusive of Indigenous communities and other vulnerable groups, and then make those recommendations for government's consideration. Currently, those public participation processes often seem like quite a tick box exercise, but I believe that if more citizens and civil society organizations were active in those processes, we could affect meaningful policy change. And aside from that, I think it's also a responsibility of civil society organizations and community-based organizations to support increasing the accessibility to that information by forming relationships with communities that hold those knowledge systems, to learn from them and include their recommendations in materials and resources that we produce for wider public dissemination. And also to create space within our platforms to bring them to the table, to share their knowledge themselves, as opposed to speaking on their behalf.
Yeah, certainly. And this is we keep coming back to this engaging and this active democracy, and especially in South Africa, we have a proportional representative system. We don't necessarily have the direct line to our legislators, as is the model in America or the UK, which is so often used exactly as a model for, oh, write your congressman. That's not necessarily the avenue that we would follow in South Africa. And it's all about educating and empowering people to find the avenues that are relevant, whether that's public consultations on policies or activating to the political party that you support, and similar. And I guess in this discussion and in these discussions of gender in particular, men can often feel excluded from those discussions, especially since the discourse often tends to quite reasonably focus on the empowerment and inclusion of historically marginalized women and girls. However, as we know, the patriarchal systems that create that marginalization, they can also be limiting and restrictive for men. There's all those articles that come out about, a lot of men don't get into environmental work because it's regarded as like a woman's thing to do, a woman's thing to care about climate. And then on the other side, we've got women that are predominantly working in those natural resource spaces in terms of being responsible for collecting fuel wood or collecting water, that they are then engaging with the natural resources in a way that men in a household might not be. But we want to make sure that we're all moving together, and that gender equality and achieving gender equality and gender justice and climate justice and social justice are all linked up together. And how do you think we can encourage men to come with us to the table whilst still ensuring that women in those spaces feel safe and heard and recognized as well, and that we're not just replicating existing systems now under a climate banner?
Sure. So I think a really nice example is going back to what Sibongile describes in that video, how young men in her community were asking to join the group at Women's Leadership and Training Program, and then seeing a change in terms of relationships after the young women and men have that shared experience of working together in a food garden. And I think it's important to remember that we don't always see things as they are, but we see things according to who we are. But by creating those shared spaces for learning and then just sort of managing guidelines and expectations for being together and communicating, I think that can support in facilitating men's understanding of women's experiences, while also helping in forming relationships and environments where women still hold their agency in those conversations when you're talking around gender equity, diversity, and inclusion and justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. And I know not only on that scale, but ACRP has recently produced the Mainstreaming Gender into South Africa's Climate Change Response as a way to kind of start that action. And this report evaluates the extent to which South Africa's current legislative and policy framework on climate change incorporates gender consideration and identifies opportunities for enhancing the gender responsiveness of South Africa's response to climate change. And what are the kind of key takeaways from this report that we should know about, and what we can do kind of in the spirit of mobilizing people beyond this webinar to keep moving forward?
Sure. So we produced this report, and it was a combination of a global and national literature review, a provincial and local policy analysis, and then combining that with interviews and focus groups with representatives of community-based organizations working in the gender and climate space. And obviously, as we know, women, and especially poor women, are one of the groups most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and least likely to have the resources to cope with them. And so what the report actually finds is that South Africa's policies and laws are mainly gender blind. They don't consider the differentiated vulnerabilities between men and women to the effects of climate change. And the lack of a gender responsive approach will only keep reinforcing those existing inequalities. So the research also shows that the law and policy framework to respond to climate change at the national level is, for the most part, not gender inclusive, including some of our key national documents. For example, the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy includes gender sensitivity as a guiding principle, but it doesn't specify any mechanisms for that. And the draft climate change bill doesn't mention gender, women, or any gender differentiated vulnerabilities. And then I think in the interviews and focus groups, the topic of water was, I think, one of the most mentioned in relation to gender and climate change for various reasons, I think, which we've also seen here today in those videos from the documentary series, where in these areas, much like Sibongile mentioned, women who were interviewed are no longer worried about whether they'll be able to fetch water for drinking or cleaning, but they're more concerned about whether they will make it home. And, there's some really interesting anecdotes from the ground there that I would really encourage everyone to download that report and read through it. But our hope is for the report to influence existing policies and development of new policies so that they're more gender responsive and the processes are more gender inclusive. And what you can do is share the report widely in your network and, again, participate in policy decision-making processes to advocate for the mainstreaming of gender in South Africa's climate change response.
And certainly, I'm sure to also, this approach and this gendered lens is not unique to climate change. It's not unique to climate change discussions. And increasingly, the research has shown us that a gender blind view that fails to acknowledge gender ultimately becomes a gender biased view by default, because we're working within these already existing marginalizing structures. So also to look at your own corporate companies' policies and your own protocols and programs and things like that, and to see, am I misconstruing gender blindness with gender equality? And to take those reflections internally as well, to see how can we promote this across the board rather than only just at a climate level, and to, as Nicole raises, to make that meaningful through mechanisms and protocols, not to just make a blanket principled commitment to gender sensitivity, which is obviously a step in the right direction, but it's not enough if there's nothing behind it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I see there's a few comments coming through in the chat, but before we wrap up with the kind of structured discussion, if anyone has questions and things like that, if you want to just pop it in the Q&A section below, we'll have a chance for some questions from the audience to discuss. But before then, to close initially, there are 3 other episodes in the series, in the Not in Our Soil series, on youth, journalism, and civil society. And we'd encourage the audience to go watch those 2. We'll be sharing the links in the chat, and it'll go in the follow-up email as well. But is there anything you'd like to say on those, Nicole? We don't have the time to screen them today,
Sure.
But is there anything you'd like to say on those to the audience, what they should look at?
So in addition to the 3 other episodes, there's also a feature film. I think they're a really great tool for starting these conversations, in whether it's with friends or families, in your organizations or community spaces and so on. And also I'm seeing some of the Rewild team on the call, also just a big shout out to them. We wouldn't have been able to make this happen without them. And it's been such a great journey making these films. And now we're in the process of sharing them with everyone. And it has just been a really wonderful experience. And thank you again for having me on here today.
Thank you for joining us, Nicole. I'm just going to pop open and see to the Q&As whether or not there's anything standing out. A couple of people have asked about how to get involved locally. There's the first action that we'll say is to join the GLFx Cape Town, GLFx Community, and the GLFx Cape Town chapter specifically. We'll be posting opportunities there from our partners and from our networks. And then within those, there's other opportunities to get involved in Cape Town and broadly afield. Although GLFx is GLFx Cape Town, our work is global, our work is across the country, and we're working with organizations that are based across South Africa. So if we're not present in your city, we can hopefully be able to refer you to local organizations, or to even bring them on board to the chapter. There's a question about, someone has asked how they can be involved here in Zambia. As far as I know, there isn't a GLFx community in Zambia yet, but I could encourage you to start one, and we can put you in touch with the GLFx team in terms of getting a chapter established in Zambia. Otherwise, Greenpop has experience working in Zambia before, and we can also refer you to other organizations that are working there. We will send out a contact after this with all the links to get involved and to connect. I see Katanya has shared a wonderful report about the fisheries and a case study on local fishing communities in South Africa and other local communities globally who are seeing and adapting to climate change. So shared a link in that, and we'll be sure to share that as well. So I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if I've missed any. Someone, agreeing it's very important to support a gendered lens in policy development and implementation. And hopefully we've encouraged you all to get involved in that at a national or local level, but also to reflect that into your own policies and implementation. Trying to see. I think if there's no further questions on that, I guess the question is what comes next? And so, like I said, first, we'd like to encourage you to watch the rest of the videos in the series and the feature film, and to share these films with your friends and networks. As Nicole said, you can use them to mobilize conversations, perhaps to host a Zoom screening yourself, or perhaps a socially distanced dinner party, or even just in your households, a bit of a movie night to talk about them. The full feature film is only 20 minutes. It's short enough, but impactful enough to get engaged. Second of all, we'd like to encourage everyone to join the GLFx community and the Cape Town chapter. In order to join, you first have to sign up for GLFx, and then you'll be able to click on the Cape Town chapter and request to join there. And that's where we'll be posting our ongoing events and activities and things like that. And you'll also be added to those networks. And finally, to give you a first option of getting involved with our partners to mobilize for restoration, if you want to quite literally get your hands dirty, Greenpop is hosting 2 open plant days, the first of which is this Friday, and then the next one is next Friday, which are at Silicanyo School. It's part of their Fynbos Urban Greening program, which is planting Fynbos gardens and outdoor classrooms in undergreened communities across the Cape Flats. And the follow-up email that we'll send to this webinar will have all the information about how to sign up for those open days and the details on how to attend. And to close, let me just double check that there's, to close, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and to Greenpop in particular for hosting today. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these films. We're so very appreciative of your time and the work that ACRP and Rewild put into these videos. And we're so excited to launch GLFx Cape Town and to play a role in developing a culture of restoration locally in order to achieve transformative change and the change that is necessary and progressive. Finally, I'll hand back to Misha briefly for the final words and parting steps. Misha, over to you.
Could someone start my video? It was a fantastic conversation. Were, yeah, really, really impactful. So yeah, I suppose from our side, we're just really excited to be taking.
Sorry to interrupt, Misha. Your signal sounds quite bad.
And kickstarting the GLFx chapter here in Cape Town, but obviously as we're in the digital age.
Oh, I'm sorry about this and about the poor signal coming through at the moment.
Beyond,
I'm not sure if Misha can hear me. And he seems to have dropped off entirely. I have a bit of insight into Misha's parting notes that he would have said. So I'll say them on his behalf. Unfortunately, he's based out in Greyton, and sometimes the signal out there is not necessarily reliable. So Misha just kind of wanted to express how excited we are to be taking these initiating steps and kickstarting a local GLFx chapter. He sees this as a great opportunity to amplify the restoration movement and to find meaningful ways to collaborate and drive social and environmental development, which is equitable at all levels. Globally, but particularly here in South Africa, we're experiencing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity and nature loss, and pollution and waste. Despite this, we're still ambitious about the future, but we acknowledge that it'll take businesses, governments, and individuals to come together in order to actively participate for meaningful change. In summarizing words from Nicole, Misha said that we need to activate for climate justice, we need to ground our innovation in nature, we need to participate in policy, and beyond this, we need to ensure that Indigenous and spiritual knowledge and mainstreaming gender inclusivity is central to our responses. Nature provides us with all the lessons and tools necessary to find the balance and to overcome the challenges that we see ahead. And the next decade, the decade on restoration, is a great opportunity to change our current trajectory, to commit to protecting and restoring ecosystems on a planetary scale. So Misha and by extension me. Wanted to give thanks to the Greenpop team and to me for making this chapter happen, to the Global Landscapes Forum team for bringing us on board, to the filmmakers for capturing these moving stories, and of changing climates, changing mindsets, and changing the narrative. And finally, thanking you, the audience. Misha and I and the rest of the GLFx Cape Town team look forward to having you with us at future Greenpop and GLFx events. Please stay in touch. Thank you all. Sorry for the change up of identities at the end there. Thank you very much. We're closing the webinar here because a few of us are due to get load shed at 2 p.m. and we didn't want to cut out abruptly, but we'll be following up with an email, and please continue to engage with us through the GLFx platform and in response to our emails. Thank you all for your engagement and your attention. We're very grateful to have had you here with us today. Thank you.